Okay, let's get started. I'm Manish Bhargava, Product Manager for Internationalization and Localization efforts at Google. And we have Andrew Warren with us, a Product Manager in the same team. He'll help us with the awesome demos that we have lined up for you. So today we are going to talk about developing for global audience. For every web user, for every smartphone user. Let's start by me asking you a few questions. How many of you here speak more than one language? Right? How many of you here are Chrome developers? How many of you are Android developers? Okay, looking at the audience, we'll focus more on the Android developer perspective. And then, how many of you have your app or product localized in more than one language? More than 5? More than 10? More than 20? More than 40? Great. You are definitely ahead of the pack. So let's talk a little bit about what we are going to talk today. We'll start by talking about developing for a global audience. Is it worth it? What does it entail? How do I go about doing it? And then once I've done it, how do I get the global customers that I intend to reach? In our journey of the what, wow, why, and how, we will essentially also do an in-depth look at various internationalization and localization tools available to you. So the very first question is it worth developing for global audience? To answer that question, let's first look at what is needed to have a successful business. You need users, and a lot of them, and you do need revenue, and probably a lot of that as well. But the question is, where are these users located? How do we get to them? So let's quickly do a quick demo. Here we have the full screen and F1. So what we are looking at is a gapminder.org chart. We are looking at internet users in terms of how internet users have changed over time. We'll do a time travel starting from 1990 onwards. The size of the bubble represents the number of internet users, and so the bigger the size, more internet users in that region. So let's start at 1990. Only noticeable dots at this point are US and Japan. And even within that scenario, it's mostly mostly coming from universities, I believe. So now let's fast forward to 2000. Notice here, in addition to US and Japan, we now also have some of the European languages show up. Now let's fast forward from 2000 to 2010. And during this phase, I would like you to focus on two aspects. One is the explosive growth in terms of internet users in the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And especially look at the last 5 years. So let's run through that. Starting from 2000, and notice how it changed. Let me again run it from 2005 again, just to highlight the difference. So based on the chart, what is the percentage of internet users that do not use English as a native language? That is correct. It's about 26% is what 26% use English as the native language. Now let's look at another similar chart. This time we are looking at cell phone users instead of internet users, and the size of the bubbles would represent number of cell phone users over time. Let's do a time travel starting from 1980 to the current time. So let's first fast forward from 1980 to 2000. Notice the penetration or the number of users or cell phone users is nearly very similar to what we saw in internet users, with US, Japan, and some of the European countries having enough presence. Now let's do the same from 2000 to 2010. What we see is very similar phenomena that we saw in the number of internet users. The penetration is, the number of cell phone users have grown in an explosive numbers during the last 5 years, especially in the BRIC countries. Okay, so what we have seen, clearly based on what we have seen, you can nearly triple the number of users by essentially developing for the global audience. And when you triple the number of users, you thereby increase your revenue as well. So let's look at the revenue numbers a little bit more carefully. So we'll talk about the Android opportunity available to you from a global perspective. Remember the keynote speech on Wednesday? We talked about and we showed on the world heat map the explosive growth in terms of Android activations over the last few years, especially outside the United States. The same is true for the app installs as well. And we believe your app should now take advantage of this huge opportunity. And we have the right infrastructure in place for you to do that. So starting with apps availability, the free apps are available in 190 languages, 190 countries, and 132 of these countries have access to the paid apps as well. Globally, 92% of all Google Play users have access to paid apps. And not surprising, 67% of all Google Play revenue comes from outside the United States. We have revenue infrastructure in place. Carrier billing is available in 7 countries, 7 key countries, and is expanding rapidly. Why is that important? Because 73% of all Google Play app purchases happens using carrier billing when it is available. And you also have access to all monetization methods that include the in-app billing, paid apps, subscription, as well as ad-funded as well. Last but not least, we have now the dev infrastructure in place. With the Wednesday announcement of the new dev console, you can now localize your listing in 22 languages, as well as tweak your international offerings based on slicing and dicing on country and language dimensions available on the analytics section of the dev console. So clearly, there's a huge opportunity which cannot be ignored. So, but the next question is, what does it entail? How do I make use of this opportunity? For what you need to do to make this happen? The 2 things that you need are internationalization and localization. Internationalization, I18N, I followed by 18 characters and N, and localization, L followed by 10 characters and N. What does internationalization mean? It essentially means designing and coding to enable support for languages, countries, and cultural differences. It includes things like extracting your strings for localization, presenting date, time, currency, number formats in the local relevant form, sorting in language-specific ways, able to work on or process user input in the given language. It also means handling bidirectional display in Middle Eastern languages, handling diacritics for Central European languages, handling double byte characters for East Asian languages. And what is localization? Localization is the process of adapting the look and feel of your app for languages, regions, and culture. What does it entail? It entails you need to do, essentially it includes things like translation, local defaults, and custom features. Let's take an example. So what you're looking at is Google Sites, specifically the image upload menu. What is wrong here? And again, I've given you a hint right there with highlighting the region. Anyone knows Arabic here? What's wrong? Yes, it is really notice how in English we have the size of the image, small, medium, or large. When it got translated in Arabic, it actually became Saturday, medium, and enlarge. Why? What happened? Well, two aspects. When this was sent for translation, the small, medium, and large were sent as separate words and with no context being provided or no description being provided. And the second, when the translator got this for translation, they had little context of where these were coming from. So again, S became sat, which essentially was translated as Saturday. Let's take a few more examples. Here, what you're looking at is Google Earth mobile app, and we are focused in the Zurich view. Anybody from Zurich here? Can you tell us what is wrong? Notice how the name of the two places have been garbled. the non-ASCII characters have been removed. Specifically, the U with the umlaut is not being displayed correctly. This is clearly an example of an internationalization or I-18N issue, where the text has not been rendered correctly. When we talked to the engineers and tried to find out what happened, the real issue was that a third-party JSON library was being leveraged to do deserialization of the JSON file, and that did not handle the escaping characters in meaningful ways. So here was the example of internationalization. Let's look at another example of, here we are talking about Google Maps in Swedish. And on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, you also see the corresponding English version as well. I'll tell you a little bit more background on this one. What a phenomena that we saw was about, in Sweden, specifically driving direction functionality we were seeing about 10 to 15% less usage of that functionality compared to to nearby places, compared to overall average worldwide. And we wanted to understand what is happening. So we put an engineer in Mountain View for about a week to try to find out what is happening. This person, essentially very smart engineer, went through all the algorithms that we are using for driving directions and how we are pulling them. They looked at all our data sources in terms of local data, and are we displaying the street names and all of those correctly. And it turned out, yes, all of that was being done correctly. Anyone knows Swedish here? Can you tell what might have been wrong? And the problem was the get direction as in English was translated as instructions in Swedish. And again, as a Google Map user, when I see instruction, I would not really think of getting driving directions based on seeing that instruction. And that really what happened. When we changed that to really mean get direction in Swedish, we suddenly saw a sudden jump in terms of the usage for the functionality, and then it became at par with other regions in the world as well. So what we want to highlight from these examples is that the user experience is impacted in a big way by how you do internationalization and localization implementation. So we have talked about what I-18N is, what localization is, but the next question is, what do I need to do? What does it really mean for me? So let's talk a little bit about a globalized application architecture, or the design in terms of how you will design your application in meaningful ways to make it happen. First is your application or your common code base, and that would essentially be common across all countries. It would contain the core of your functionality, and this would be language neutral. This is where all your key algorithms and everything would go. The next set, which you would essentially separate out in meaningful ways, is the globalization services. Anything that is language dependent, so it could be things like handling of date, time, currencies, displaying them correctly, extraction, and things, anything which is language dependent would essentially fall under here, and you would essentially use different libraries to handle them effectively. The next set is the locale data. So essentially, it's important to separate localizable resources from your main code base. So examples of localizable resources could be text, images, and so on. So notice here how the English, Japanese, and French versions are all separated out. So if you were to use, for example, Java, you would essentially use resource bundles to handle these language sources. And having those separated makes it easy for localization as well. And then finally is the plugin, which essentially think of that as a custom feature for your local markets. Why is that important? It really brings the wow factor for your app. Think of, like, we had the transit app in German, and when we introduced the German train schedules, that really made people feel, wow, this app has been made for me, rather than something which was just ported over from US with some cosmetic changes. Another example is we introduced cricket scores on Google News in India. When we did that, on the days when the cricket match was on, we saw about 8 to 10% increase in daily traffic. Why? People were able to essentially, again, cricket and Bollywood are pretty popular in India, and when people would essentially come and see those scores on Google News when the game was on those days. So here is the complete picture of internationalization. Here is how you would typically do your internationalization from a design perspective, and how you would have your different parts of your code base separated out in meaningful ways, so that you can essentially then extend in meaningful ways and make your code base ready for localization. Now let's look at some of the available tools that will help you to make this happen. Here are some tools that are listed for internationalization. Some of these tools we are actively working on. Some of these tools we actively contribute to. But in either of those scenarios, these are the exact same tools that we use at Google for our internationalization as well. So the first is the ICU, International Component for Unicode. Think of that as a hidden gold mine for you. It really provides you the right libraries in various programming languages, C, C++, Java, for you to handle Unicode and globalization in meaningful ways. So you can handle things like date, time, currency formatting, and much more using this library. The next library is the lib phone number library. It essentially handles the international phone numbers for you. It essentially incorporates all world regions, including so things like area code, country codes, and all the intricacies involved. It essentially encapsulates all of that and gives you a simple interface by which you can essentially do parsing, formatting, storing, and validating of phone numbers across any region in the world. And again, pretty powerful in respect to that. In terms of JavaScript, the Google Web Toolkit and Closure tools provide internationalization support for JavaScript. We are extending that support using the ECMAScript standards process further as well. For input, research has clearly shown that users tend to use an app more if they are able to input in their own language. And that's where Google Input Tools, a Chrome extension, comes into play. It is a tool that allows users to input in 80+ languages on any text box on any web page. Why don't we first look at a quick introductory video, and then Andrew will do a quick demo of that as well.
Here we go.
There's this word in Chinese, 香, that kind of means smells good. It could describe flour, food, really anything, but it's always a positive description for things. It's hard to translate into something other than Mandarin.
We have this word in Fiji Hindi called talanoa. Really, it is the feeling that you get late on a Friday night, surrounded by your friends, shooting the breeze, but it's not quite that. It's a sort of warmer and friendlier version of small talk. Just about everything that you could think of off the top of your head.
There's this Greek word, meraki, that means to really put your soul, put your entire being into what you're doing, whether it's your hobby or it's your work. You're doing it with love for what you're doing. But it's one of those cultural things that I've never been able to come up with a good translation. Meraki. With passion. With love.
Great. Andrew, why don't you give us a quick demo of the same?
Certainly. So as Manish was mentioning earlier, the majority of web users online, and the majority of users of cell phones, and the majority of pretty much all of Google's users and internet users are not from English-speaking countries and don't speak English natively. What's more, and much more important, the majority of users coming online at this point, the majority of users who are just beginning to use these technologies are not native English speakers, and in most cases are not English speakers at all. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Google is make it easier for these new users to actively engage online, to create content, to communicate with people in their own languages. And so one of the ways that we're doing that is this project called Input Tools, which is project to make it easy to enter text in whatever language you'd like to. So I'll be giving a brief demonstration of the Chrome extension that we've recently put out for this purpose. All a user needs to do after installing the Chrome extension is choose the languages that he or she might want to type in. So in this case, I'll add some Chinese input methods and some Hindi input methods. And then that's pretty much it. From there, if the user wants to enter text in one of those languages or in a language that they don't have the right keyboard for, don't have the right input tools for on their computer, all they need to do is enable the Chrome extension and tell it which language they'd like to type in. And from there, we use server-side dictionaries and language models to determine what words they're looking for and what words they might want to type. So we have this available for IMEs, for Chinese and Japanese, which includes the keyboard shortcuts that Chinese and Japanese users are probably familiar with already from client-side IMEs. We have a number of transliteration tools for speakers of Indic languages and others. And then we also have a number of virtual keyboards, which we offer, which can both be used to literally type using the mouse, or which can be used just as a keyboard mapping if the user is already familiar with that keyboard but doesn't have it available where they are at the moment. So this is something that we have available for over 80 different languages already in the Chrome extension for online users, and are also working to bring to other platforms as well. So we have all of the 20+ transliteration languages and Chinese and Japanese available on Windows. And then we also have brought Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and a number of other languages to Android, and are continuing to build out the number of languages we support so that more users can create content, more users can communicate with one another in whatever language they'd like to.
Great.
So post-demo, there's a couple of important implications of this for developers as well, for input tools. The first of these is that you never know what tools people might be using to enter text into your website or into your application. So specifically, they may be using this input tools extension, they may be using a client-side IME of some kind, or they may be using other accessibility tools like Chromevox to read what's on the screen or what's in a text box or know where a text box is. And so it's very important that when you build applications, particularly web applications, but also Android applications, that you're using standard components and standard pieces of HTML, and don't do anything terribly fancy with input boxes, with editable divs, so that these tools will work for users not just within the US and Europe, but also for users around the world. The second key takeaway for developers is that you don't really know what types of content are coming into your application or where they're coming from. So you may be getting all types of content in all kinds of languages, in all kinds of encodings, whereas you may not have designed it for that. So it's important for applications to be built from the ground up, supporting Unicode, and assuming Unicode is coming into the application and processing all of the strings and any other aspects of what the application does, assuming Unicode and in Unicode. So from a developer's perspective, there's a lot of other things that need to go into an application to ensure that technologies like these work for users around the world.
Great, thank you, Andrew. So up to this point, we have looked at internationalization, what it entails, what is the global design look like, global architecture looks like, and then we have also looked at some of the internationalization tools. Now let's do the same for localization. First of all, here are the 5 points that you will need to do for localization, irrespective of what you're localizing. So it could be your Android apps, it could be your Chrome apps, it could be your website, it could be your static documents, static files, documents. First of all, you need to determine your target language set. And again, that's a very important decision that needs to happen. And again, that may change over time as well. We will talk about some of the considerations for that in our next slide. Second is separating localizable resources from your source code. And again, we saw on the global architecture design, that was essentially the third set of box. And that is very critical for you to essentially have a good localized experience. You don't want hard-coded strings in your application to show up, especially when people are accessing it in different languages. The third aspect is test your application for localizability issues. Now, how do you know whether it's ready for localization, ready for actual localization? You would essentially, at the point when you are ready for translation, you should be able to not requiring any re-engineering or code changes. In that case, we have taken care of most of the localizability issues. And pseudo-localization tools are really your friend here at this point for that. Those tools can help you find problems like text swelling, hard-coded strings, not handling accented characters, even before you actually do the localization. And again, we would highly encourage you to use those at that phase in terms of your pseudo-localization. The fourth is you will choose a localization vendor, and either them or you will choose the localization tool that you use. Important consideration for localization tools are it should have advanced technologies like the translation memory, glossary, and so on. As I talked in the previous slide, let's talk a little bit more about the various considerations, the key considerations that you have when deciding which locale, a combination of your country and location, you would like to have your app or your product available in. Broadly, the considerations could be divided into two types. One is the key metrics, based on various key metrics, and again, there could be a variety of them. And the second is based on the effort required for implementation of these. So let's talk more about the key metrics. So again, there could be a variety of different key metrics that you could base your decision in terms of which countries or which languages to go after. You could essentially decide based on top languages used on the web. You could essentially base it on top countries by cell phone usage, top countries by paid app installs. You could essentially go by what my competitor offers. If competitor is localized in 15 languages, you might do the same as well. And then finally, there could be some app-specific metric as well. So for example, if you are a game developer, you might want to go by the top countries by paid game downloads. So let's say we pick one. We go by top languages used on the web. And we localize in 10 languages. So you essentially pick the top 10 languages on the internet and say, OK, I will localize in those. Question for the audience. What is the percentage of users you can cover if you essentially do that? You would essentially localize your app in top 10 languages. What percentage of internet users would you cover? Yes, it is 82%, absolutely right. You essentially, and again, let's see a little bit more details here. So this is the breakdown of the top 10 languages and then the remaining set. So notice English is about 26%, Chinese is pretty close, 24%, and then you can see the remaining ones. After the top 10, which is about 82%, the rest of the languages constitute about 17.8%. So let's look a little bit more carefully here. If you pick the top 5, you include Chinese in here. If you include the top 10, you also include Arabic here. These are languages that require spatial handling for doing localization and internationalization correctly for these languages. So you might want to do some cherry picking in terms of which languages you want to localize your app into based on where you are. And that's a good segue into our second aspect in terms of effort required for implementing those languages. So there's a natural grouping of languages. So let's say your app currently is in English. Now, what is the next set of languages that you could go after? The next set, which adds a little bit of complexity, but not that much, is the Latin script languages. These are languages which include FIGS, French, Italian, German, Spanish, Indonesian, Romanian, Vietnamese, and so on. There are three things that this set of languages add in terms of complexity for your app. First is ability to handle the language preference. So users should be able to choose from a drop-down, so language picker, and say, OK, I want now my app to be in German, Spanish, and so on. The second is ability to search in those languages in your app. And for that, you need language detection mechanism as well. So with those, you can pretty much try and target the Latin script languages. You would probably need some bit of testing as well. The next set of languages that you can target are non-Latin European languages. These would include languages like Russian, Ukrainian, Serbian, and Greek. In addition to what we described for Latin script languages, there are added complexities in terms of transliteration is important for these languages. Plus, for languages like Serbian, the interchangeability between the Latin script keyboards and the Cyrillic script Cyrillic keyboards becomes an important aspect to consider as well. The next set of languages are the CJK, the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. here the complexities are, first is the font size. You need to take care of that because characters typically tend to be bigger in size. The second is the display mechanism might change. So some of these languages are displayed vertically as well. And the third aspect is input. So input method editors become an important aspect. Why? Because just the enormous number of characters in these languages. The next set of languages are the South and Southeast Asian languages, specifically Thai and Hindi. Why they are typical because of you need to handle the contextual display. The characters in these languages essentially change based on the context. And the second important aspect is the Thai segmentation. So in Thai, where it is the words are not separated by white space, you need to take care of especially from a search perspective, how the segmentation is done correctly. And the last set of languages are the bidirectional languages, which include Arabic, Hebrew, Persian, Urdu. And these are really the most challenging languages from engineering perspective. Why are these called bidirectional languages? Mainly because the text goes from right to left and the numbers go from left to right. Special attention is needed for the user interface, especially in those languages. Now let's look at some of the available tools for each of these applications, each of these kind of applications. So Android apps, Chrome Web Store apps, your website, and your static files and docs as well. So let's take them one by one. So first is localization of your Android apps. It is important to, as we mentioned earlier as well, it is important for you to have a localization strategy. By that we mean you need to know which languages and which countries you are going to localize your app into, which is your default set for your default set of language and country, and finally what happens when somebody accesses your app in a locale which you are not localizing into. So here are the three things that happen in that scenario. First is you need, as I said, you create your resource sets for each of the locale that you want to go in. At runtime, the resource set is matching the device locale is loaded. And if locale specific resources are not available, Android falls back to the defaults. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the technical details here. So strings.xml file contains your translated strings. So under res/values, that's where your strings.xml in that directory would contain the default translations. So let's say if you were to translate in French and Arabic, you would also have directories called res/values-fr and res/values-ar respectively. And strings.xml within those directory would contain the translated strings for French and Arabic as well. And let's say if you had other resources as well that needed to be translated, so graphics, for example, you would have res/drawable-ja for handling the graphics in Japanese, for example. So here is the typical Android localization process. You essentially have three steps here: the planning and design phase, the actual translation, and then finally testing and publishing. Right at the very bottom, you see the link to the guide for localization in developers.android.com, and that you will find essentially all details for each of the step, what you need to do there. What I would highly encourage for everyone to do here, if you haven't done that already, is to take the Hello L10 example, so Hello localization example, similar to the Hello World examples when you try a new language. It lists in a very simple way all the steps that you need to do to have your first localized version of the app. And it's a very simple app, just has few phrases and the map and the map for that country, and displays that. So again, if you haven't done this, I would highly encourage you to try this localization, the Hello L10N example. And again, you will find that in localization guide at developers.android.com. Now let's look at localization of the Chrome Web Store apps. One important aspect here is that you can do your listing in 43 locales from the Chrome dashboard, developer dashboard. And the second, depending on whether you have an extension or packaged app or hosted app, your app localization mechanism would be different. So let's look a little bit more at the Chrome, at the extension and packaged app, where you have more control over the files right in your dashboard. From a technical perspective, your messages.json file will contain the translations. you will define your default locale in your manifest.json file, and you would essentially have your different translations in _locale directory. So for example, again, taking the same example, if you have French and Arabic, you would essentially have _locale / fr, and then within that you will have the message.json file, and same for _locale / ar / JSON file to contain the Arabic translations as well. In terms of localization process, it is again very similar to what we described in the Android process as well. The planning and design phase, the translation phase, and then the testing and publishing phase. One important distinction is that you essentially provide the localized description and screenshots at the time when you're uploading for each language at one time. So again, the reference there at the bottom, code.google.com/chrome, extension i18n.xml, you will find all the details about the Chrome Web Store localization as well. Now let's talk about localizing your website. With Google Website Translator, you can instantly translate your website into 60+ languages. Sounds interesting? Want to find out more? Let's look at a video.
The Website Translator plugin, powered by Google Translate, allows you to quickly and easily make your website or blog instantly available in 60+ languages. Just add the plugin code snippet to your page where you'd like the language selector to appear, and whenever an international user visits your page, they can select their language in the drop-down, and your page will be instantly translated into the language. While the quality of translation from Google Translate is quite good, it's not always perfect. For these situations, the Website Translator plugin allows you to polish and improve the translation. After you translate the page, just hover over the translated sentence you'd like to improve and enter the correction in the pop-up. Your correction will now be used whenever someone translates your page. Users visiting your site can also suggest translations using the same process. However, these suggestions won't be used until you approve. You can manage these suggestions in the Website Translator's Web Management interface. Just select and approve the suggestion, and it will be used whenever someone translates your page. Add the Website Translator plugin to your website now, and make your website globally accessible.
This was Jeff Chin, again on our team, who works on the Google Website Translator. So again, as was described in the video, you can instantly translate in 60+ languages. But what we launched about a month back is very powerful. We're not just using the machine translation. You can now customize and improve your website translation by manually going in and correcting what might be wrong. In addition, you can also collect and use the translation suggestions from your users as well. And again, you can invite editors to manage your translations, and that way you essentially, again, make your website instantly available for a lot of users worldwide. So we already did that. Let's now look at localization of your documents, localization of your static files. You could essentially use Google Translation Toolkit, GTT, for doing that. What is GTT? GTT is Google's localization platform for human translators. They can essentially use this to do the translation more faster and more accurately, aided by technologies like Google Translate. It essentially supports a wide variety of document types. To name a few, you essentially can get your Word documents, your open office files, your rich text file formats, your HTML, text files, PO files, Android resources, Chrome extensions, and AdWord campaign, Wikipedia articles. So again, a slew of stuff that you can essentially localize using the tool. It supports more than 300 source and target languages, and it has a simple what you see is what you get WYSIWYG editor. And the best part of all of this, it's essentially totally free tool. So you can essentially leverage that for your translations as well. We would also like to talk a little bit more about things that are in works. Given what you have heard over the last 2 years, Android apps and Chrome apps are a very important part of our ecosystem. And given that, we want to now optimize on our app localization platform, especially for Android and Chrome apps. We also would like to essentially working on optimizing our YouTube caption localization process as well. With respect to the apps localization platform, Andrew, why don't you give us a sneak peek into that?
Sure. So as Manish mentioned, we're working on a new form of the Google Translation Toolkit that is focused on application translation and localization. So in particular, the main point of this tool is to make it so that developers don't really need to understand what goes on behind the scenes for a translator and all of the tools that they need to use to properly localize something. And a translator doesn't need to understand what's going on behind the scenes of an application and need to understand the structure of the application and where the files sit in the application, all of that information. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for developers and for translators to do their job without needing to understand each other's roles as much. So given that, all a developer needs to do upon coming to this system is add the resource files from their application from whatever framework they've been using. So we support Java properties files, Ruby on Rails YAML files, a number of other file formats from popular frameworks, and are continuing to add more files as we go along. And then choose the languages that the developer wants their app to be translated into. So in this case, we've chosen Arabic, Chinese, Spanish, and Thai. And then the last step from a developer's perspective is to add collaborators to that project. So decide who you want to come help you translate this. It could be friends or family who speak other languages and have offered to help translate. It could be community members or members of your user base who've offered to help translate your application to their language. Or it could be professional translators who you've decided to hire to come in and translate your application in your first international launch to 5 languages or something of that nature. So after adding collaborators and the translators, the developer's job is effectively done here. They don't need to understand what happens after that point. But if you want to, you can go into that part of the process, and we'll show you a little bit of what that looks like as well. So when a translator gets an invitation to come in and work on a translation project for any of the apps that developers might upload here, what they'll see is the actual translation interface. Where we've basically laid out all of the messages that need to be translated and kind of abstracted away all of the different files those came from, where they sit in the application, and the translator can just go ahead and enter translations as they go along. A few other features that make this a little bit more convenient is we've also abstracted away the individual placeholder support for each language. So a translator can use placeholders without needing to understand how the programming language that was used actually implements placeholders. And we just go ahead when the developer comes back to export the file and replace it with the placeholders that that language is using. Another thing that's convenient, particularly for application translation, is the suggestions feature, which allows us to offer suggestions both from Google Translate, but also from previous translations within that application or within that project. So if you have a number of translators coming in and the word photos has been translated somewhere earlier on, but you now have a new phrase in the application, view my photos, then that translator will get a preview, a suggestion of what word to use there so that you maintain a consistent translation throughout the entire project. The most important thing that we found when looking at why applications are very different from static files and from other types of content that you might want to localize is that applications have very short UI strings, and so it's very difficult to get a sense of what an individual string or message might mean for a translator, which leads to issues like Manish described before. Small, medium, and large becomes Saturday, medium, and large. These sorts of things stem from translators not understanding what a message is supposed to be in the actual application. So what we've worked hard to do is make sure that we give developers the ability to capture very easily the context of their application and to capture snapshots so that the translator can translate in context exactly what the message means and can see in real time how that impacts what the message looks like in the UI. A couple of other very convenient aspects of this that help the localization process significantly is that the developer can come through after the fact and take a look at all messages that have or haven't been translated and get a sense of everything looks fine in Chinese except there's this English word over here that's still in English. So clearly I missed something when I was putting things into my resource bundles. The other thing that's somewhat nice about this is a developer can come back to this UI if they want to after the translation is complete and can see the impact that the translation has on the UI, because the process we use to capture the messages from the application not only captures the HTML on the actual snapshot, but it also captures the CSS. So we actually have the style information, and you can see in real time what happens when a particular message breaks the UI. In this case, a very long message might push some of these items onto the next line, which would break the UI and break the CSS. So the developer can get a sense of where problems are in their interface and can fix those problems before redeploying the app in new languages. So this is something that we're continuing to work on and are looking forward to making available publicly in the near future.
Great. That was great, especially the screenshot part. Thank you, Andrew. OK, so we are at a point where we have looked at globalization and getting your app for global audience makes a lot of sense. We also looked at what it entails and how do we achieve that in terms of both internationalization and localization. We looked at available tools. Now, let's say you have done all of that. You have now a localized app. What's next? The natural question is, how do I get my app now to the right audience? So how do I find the customers, and how do the global customers find me? So listed here are some of the practical tips for you to market your app, especially on various Google marketplaces, including Chrome Web Store, including Google Play for Android apps as well. So first and foremost, if you do nothing else, you should localize your marketplace metadata into different languages. That by itself significantly improves your app's ranking in the marketplace, specifically for that locale. So that's the first and foremost part. The second is maximize your search potential. Why is that important? Because search accounts for about 2/3 of all installs and sales on Google Play. How do you do that? How do you maximize your search potential? Think of the keywords. Think of the keywords that somebody would search for when your app should show up, and include those in your title, in your description. Both of these fields are indexed from a search perspective, and once you have included those keywords in the respective locales as well, the findability of your app increases multifolds in terms of from a search perspective. One key insight in terms of, again, ranking of your app in these locale, there are three main factors that go into that. One is high number of installs. The second is low number of uninstalls. And the third is long-term usage. So how many users are using your app over a long period of time? So for that, the steady effort on your part for internationalization and localization becomes a very key factor here. So think of your investment in terms of like advertising campaign and so on over a period of time rather than in just being in short bursts. Lastly, localize your app listing. So make sure, localize your app screenshots. If your app screenshot reflect the actual user experience, the number of the installs go higher, and more importantly, number of uninstalls go lower. And that again helps in terms of findability of your app on various marketplaces. So take-home message. Important thing to note here is, if you, like, again, we covered a lot of details here. If you forget most of the stuff, please remember these 4 things. First is, it is never too late to start. So if you haven't done that, you still have your app only in English or one of the languages, get started now, get started today. Opportunity, as we have shown in the initial slide, opportunity is just too big for you to ignore. So focus on that. The third is, it is relatively very simple to get started. And again, it will not get you in the perfect state right away, but you will get there. So things like, just remove any hard-coded string, externalize them, make them as resource bundles, and send them for translation. Use a few libraries so that you do the number handling, date formats, currency formats, etc. correctly. And then get your friend, get your family to come and help you translate in just one language. So you can essentially take all your strings and say, OK, we are good to go. Let's essentially use these and just do it for one language. It would not be perfect, as I said, but it will put you in the right direction, on the right path. Finally, localize your marketplace metadata, as I just mentioned. This by itself significantly improves findability of your app on marketplace, specifically the Chrome Web Store as well as Google Play as well. That brings us to the conclusion of our talk. Most of the stuff that we have referenced here, you can find on developer, or referenced what we have covered here, you can essentially find on developer.google.com/international. And this would be the place where we will also keep updating as we launch more functionality, as the GTTA comes out, you will essentially find the updates here. So again, it's developers.google.com. That's pretty much it. We are out of time for questions. Thank you.